What would you do if someone told you they had stood before Jesus and he had shown them exactly what was coming next, not in vague symbols or mysterious language, but in clear and specific detail about events approaching in March 2026? Would you listen, or would you look away? This story arrived in my inbox on a quiet evening, and I haven't stopped thinking about it since. A woman who had spent her career in one of the most grounded and practical professions imaginable found herself one afternoon standing somewhere that no map covers. And what she was shown there was so specific, so structured, so unlike anything she could have constructed from her own imagination, that she has been carefully and quietly sharing it ever since, with anyone willing to listen without rushing to a conclusion. If stories like this one, told plainly and without exaggeration, are the kind that help you slow down and think more carefully about what might be approaching, then you've found somewhere worth settling into tonight. Today's story was sent to me by email from Catherine Ann Loris. And now, let's listen to what happened to her. Hello? My name is Catherine Ann Loris, and I want to begin simply. I was 54 years old when what I'm about to describe happened to me. I had spent 26 years as a structural engineer, a profession that rewards precision, that demands accuracy, that has very little patience for approximation or wishful thinking. Every bridge I ever assessed, every building I ever evaluated, lived or failed based on the accuracy of the measurements I brought to it. I was not a person given to mystical thinking. I was a person who trusted load calculations and stress tolerances and the reliable language of physics. I tell you this not to establish credentials, but to give you an honest picture of the person this happened to, because I think it matters that experiences like mine don't only happen to people already oriented toward them. I had faith, a quiet and consistent faith that I had carried since childhood, but I held it in a separate room from my professional life and never expected the two to collide in any dramatic way. I prayed. I attended a small church I had been part of for 15 years. I believed. But I believed in the steady, undramatic way of someone who has never been given particular reason to expect the extraordinary. What happened to me on that February afternoon was not something I sought, not something I prepared for, not something that arrived with any advance warning that would have allowed me to arrange myself to receive it more gracefully. It arrived the way structural failures sometimes arrive, with a quiet preceding period in which the signs were present for anyone who knew how to read them, and then a moment of decisive change that rearranged everything. The difference being that what I experienced was not a failure of any kind. It was something closer to the opposite, a sudden and complete revelation of a load-bearing reality I had never had the instruments to measure before. The afternoon it happened was a Tuesday in February, unremarkable in every visible respect. I had been reviewing structural assessments for a commercial building project that had been on my desk for 3 weeks. The kind of detailed technical work that requires sustained concentration and produces a particular quality of focused fatigue by mid-afternoon. I had made coffee. I had reviewed my calculations twice, as I always did. I had responded to 2 emails from a site engineer with questions about load distribution on the 3rd floor. The first indication that something was different arrived as a quality of stillness that settled over the room without announcement. The particular kind of stillness that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that makes sound seem irrelevant. I noticed it the way you notice a change in air pressure before a significant weather system arrives. Not as a specific sensation, but as an ambient shift. Something in the quality of the afternoon had changed, and the change was moving toward me rather than away. My physical experience began to alter in a way that was gradual enough to observe, but too thoroughgoing to resist. A warmth that arrived in the center of my chest and spread outward with the quiet inevitability of something that had been waiting for the right moment. My awareness of the desk in front of me, the calculations spread across it, the half-finished coffee cooling at my elbow, began to soften at the edges, each familiar object growing slightly less insistent in its claim on my attention, as though the room were slowly and gently releasing its grip on me, and I on it, with a quality of mutual and unhurried agreement that held nothing frightening in it at all. What I moved into when the familiar receded was not absence. That is the first and most important thing I can say about it. There is a natural assumption that the removal of physical sensation would produce something like blankness, like the space between thoughts, but what I encountered was the opposite of blank. It was perhaps the most thoroughly inhabited space I had ever been in, dense with a quality of presence that had no physical form, but was more substantially real than anything my instruments had ever measured. My awareness in that space was unusually acute, sharper in some respects than my ordinary waking consciousness rather than dimmer. I could perceive layers of my own interior experience with a clarity that surprised me, the particular texture of my own habitual thinking patterns, the specific quality of the fears I had organized my professional precision around, the shape of the longings I had kept carefully in their place for decades, all of it visible without the usual soft focus that self-perception tends to apply, and all of it held in an atmosphere that met the seeing of it with something that felt entirely like acceptance. Time had changed its behavior in a way that my engineering mind found simultaneously disorienting and fascinating. In my professional life, time was a reliable variable. Sequences were fixed. Causes preceded effects in the reliable linear order that made calculation possible. But in this space, time seemed to have unfolded from its linear arrangement into something more like a landscape that could be surveyed from a sufficient altitude simultaneously. I was aware of my own history as a kind of terrain I was looking at rather than moving through, and I was aware that the terrain extended forward in a direction I hadn't yet traveled, and that what lay in that direction was not hidden, but simply not yet reached. Ahead in my story, the landscape of what has not yet arrived begins to come into focus. And as I go deeper into what I was shown, there is a moment where 4 specific points in that forward terrain become visible with a clarity that I have spent every day since trying to honor in how I describe them. What I was shown about March 2026 was not symbolic or impressionistic. It had the specific quality of structural information, detailed, load-bearing, the kind of thing a person with my training recognizes immediately as something that has been carefully designed rather than casually assembled. And the recognition of that quality of design was itself one of the most significant things I experienced. The presence I became aware of in that space arrived in the manner of something that had always been there. This is the most accurate thing I can say about it. Not arriving from outside, but becoming perceivable from within. The way a sound you have been hearing as background gradually becomes distinguishable as music. The presence had the quality of something that had been present throughout my entire life, threaded through every ordinary day, available at every moment, simply awaiting the particular quality of attention that would allow it to register fully. What struck me most immediately was a quality I can only describe as structural integrity at a scale I had no prior framework for. In my profession, I had developed a refined sense for the difference between things that were load-bearing and things that appeared to be, between genuine structural elements and decorative ones. between what would hold and what would eventually fail under real pressure. The presence I was now within had the quality of something that would hold under any conceivable pressure, not because it was resistant or rigid, but because its nature was simply incompatible with failure. It was the load-bearing reality beneath every other load-bearing reality I had ever assessed. I became aware within that presence of being known with a completeness that had a specific quality different from simply being observed. There is a difference between being watched and being understood, between being assessed and being known. And what I experienced was firmly in the second category of each distinction. I was known the way a structure is known by the engineer who designed it. Not just its surface properties and visible characteristics, but its internal logic, its stress points, the places where it had been reinforced and the places where it remained vulnerable, all of it known with the affectionate precision of a designer who has thought carefully about every element and remains genuinely interested in how the whole thing is holding together. I want to try to describe what I perceived as I became more fully aware of the presence I was within, because I think the specific qualities of it matter and deserve more than the general language that is usually brought to these descriptions. The first quality I noticed was its completeness. Not completeness in the sense of being finished or closed, but in the sense of being thoroughly itself in every direction simultaneously, without remainder, without anything held back or in reserve. The way a well-designed structure expresses its design principle in every element, from its largest span to its smallest connection. The second quality was what I can only call purposeful attention, a quality of being attended to that felt directed and specific rather than ambient or general. I had been in rooms with genuinely attentive people before, had experienced the particular quality of presence that a skilled and caring person brings to a conversation. But this was orders of magnitude beyond any human version of that quality. It was attention that held nothing else simultaneously, that found me entirely sufficient reason to be completely present, without the partial elsewhere quality that even the most attentive human presence carries. The third quality was the one that took me longest to identify accurately. And when I found the right word for it, I found it surprising. The word was delight. There was something in the quality of the presence that held me that had the specific character of genuine delight. Not the performative warmth of someone managing an encounter well, but the real and unguarded quality of someone who is genuinely pleased that you are there. It was this quality more than any other that dismantled the residual tension I had carried into that space. The professional wariness, the instinct to verify and cross-check before trusting. Something about being delighted in dissolved a guardedness I hadn't known I was maintaining. What was about to be shown to me arrived with a quality of preparation, as though the space around me were arranging itself to function as a kind of viewing environment, the way a room is prepared before something significant is presented within it. I became aware of a shift in the quality of my perception, a deepening of the clarity I had been experiencing, a focusing of attention toward what I can only describe as a forward-facing direction, toward the part of the temporal landscape I had not yet traveled. The first thing I understood before any specific content arrived was something about the nature of what I was about to receive. I perceived it clearly as information that was being intentionally shown rather than information I was independently discovering. The distinction between being led to something and stumbling upon it. This was the former, deliberate, specific, curated with care for what I in particular would be able to receive and usefully carry back. I was not being given everything. I was being given what was mine to carry. and the specificity of that selection was itself a kind of communication. March 2026 became visible in the temporal landscape the way a specific geological formation becomes visible as you approach it, first as a quality of terrain, then as a distinct shape, then with increasing detail as proximity increases. I could perceive it as a convergence point, a place where multiple streams of what I understood as divine preparation were meeting, not coincidentally but in the way that structural elements meet at a designed junction, each one load-bearing, each one contributing something the others didn't, the meeting point itself stronger than any single element that arrived at it. And within that convergence point, 4 specific things began to take shape with a clarity that I have not been able to set aside since. The first of the 4 things I was shown had a quality that I find difficult to render in language designed for predictable events, because its defining characteristic was precisely its unexpectedness, not random unpredictability, but the specific quality of something that arrives through channels that had not been identified as channels, reaching people through routes that no planning or preparation had designated as routes. I was shown something like a wave, and I use that word in the specific engineering sense of a propagating disturbance that moves through a medium and changes the state of what it passes through. Not destructively, but transformationally. The medium in this case being the interior lives of people who had not been anticipating contact with anything beyond the ordinary. People whose days were filled with the ordinary contents of ordinary lives, who had not sought extraordinary experience and were not oriented toward receiving it. What I perceived within this first event was the specific quality of the encounters, each one deeply individual, calibrated to the particular interior landscape of the person receiving it, arriving through the specific channel most likely to reach that specific person. A piece of music that carried something beyond its notes for someone who had stopped believing anything could reach them. A conversation that turned in an unexpected direction and ended somewhere neither participant had planned. A moment of stillness in an otherwise unremarkable day that suddenly felt inhabited by something the person had no adequate category for, but could not dismiss. Each encounter unique in its delivery, unanimous in its quality, in the specific character of what it left behind in the person it touched. The second of the 4 events had a structural quality that appealed to my professional instincts. It had the character of something designed, of outcomes that had been engineered at a level above human planning, and the recognition of that design quality was one of the clearest things I perceived within it. I was shown what I can only describe as openings, not metaphorical openings, but specific ones, situations that had been genuinely closed, relationships that had reached genuine impasse, opportunities that had genuinely expired, beginning to open in ways that had no adequate natural explanation. What distinguished what I was shown from simple positive thinking or wishful narrative about things getting better was the specific quality of the openings. They came not as improvements to existing situations, but as entirely new configurations that had not been available before. The way a building that has been structurally compromised sometimes requires not repair but redesign. Not the fixing of what existed, but the creation of something new that the old structure was actually preventing. I perceived people walking through openings into spaces that had not existed in any form they could previously have imagined, and the walking through requiring a quality of courage that the closeness had actually been developing in them during the period of waiting. There was a detail within this second event that I've returned to often since, which was something about the relationship between the timing of the opening and the interior preparation of the person encountering it. I perceived that in most of the cases I was shown, The door had not been sealed against the person but for them. That what appeared to be obstruction had actually been a form of development, that the frustration and the waiting and the repeated return to a situation that refused to resolve had been doing something in the interior of the person that the opening would now require. I found this both consoling and challenging in equal measure. Consoling because it suggested that nothing genuinely desired is lost, and challenging because it required a complete reframing of what I had understood obstruction to mean. The third event had a different scale than the first two. Those had felt primarily individual in their operation, person by person, encounter by encounter, opening by opening. This third thing had a communal quality, a wider radius of effect, touching not just individuals, but the spaces between individuals, the specific quality of relationship and atmosphere that exists when people who share a location or a commitment come together. What I perceived was something shifting in the interior atmosphere of communities. And I want to be specific about what I mean by atmosphere, because I don't mean it loosely. In my professional life, I understood that buildings had atmospheres, specific qualities of space and light and proportion that affected the people within them in ways that were real and measurable, even when they were difficult to attribute to any single design element. Communities have atmospheres in the same way, qualities of trust and openness and genuine care that can be present or absent, can be thick or thin, can be cultivated or neglected. And what I was shown was a shift in those atmospheres toward a quality I perceived as both older and more necessary than anything currently replacing it. The specific quality of the shift I was shown involved something about the recovery of genuine presence, of people being actually rather than performatively with each other, of the particular depth of contact that requires vulnerability and produces the kind of trust that cannot be manufactured through programming or events. I perceived communities where this shift was arriving, where the quality of what passed between people in ordinary interaction was changing towards something more honest, more substantial, more willing to occupy the difficult registers of experience that community is actually for. And the effect of this change on individuals within those communities was visible in what I was shown as something like a structural reinforcement, as though the genuine quality of being with others was load-bearing in a way that its counterfeit was not. The fourth and final event I was shown carried an emotional quality that was distinct from the first three. Those had carried qualities of awakening and opening and deepening. But this fourth thing carried something I can only describe as the specific warmth of resolution, of something long-standing finally being addressed at its root, of a kind of healing whose significance exceeded what either party involved had understood themselves to be hoping for. What I was shown was reconciliation, but not the kind that is produced by negotiation or by the careful management of competing interests, not the kind that requires both parties to give up things they valued in order to arrive at a position neither wanted. This was something with an entirely different mechanism, reconciliation that arrived through a shift in how each side perceived the other, a shift that came not from argument or persuasion, but from a quality of encounter with something larger than the dispute, that made the dispute visible in its true proportions, which turned out to be much smaller than the investment each side had made in maintaining it. I perceived this reconciliation operating at multiple scales simultaneously. Individual relationships, healing between people who had held distance for years, family units finding their way back to a quality of contact that estrangement had interrupted, and larger communal divisions beginning to show the first signs of yielding, not dramatically, not through any announced resolution, but through the particular quiet of people who have simultaneously arrived at the exhaustion of maintaining a position that has cost them more than it ever protected them from. The fourth event had the quality of something whose time had simply arrived. Not forced, not manufactured, simply ready. After showing me the four events individually, what came next was an understanding of how they related to each other. And this turned out to be as significant as any single event I had been shown, because what became clear was that these were not four separate or coincidental occurrences. They were four expressions of a single movement, four aspects of something coherent. The way four different load-bearing elements in a well-designed structure each contribute to a single structural intention. The first event, the wave of unexpected individual encounter, was the foundation, the thing that made everything else possible by creating people who had been genuinely touched and genuinely changed at the interior level. People who carried something new into the spaces they inhabited, and whose presence in those spaces created conditions for what followed. The second event, the opening of doors that had been sealed, built on the first by providing the new territory that the changed people required to move into, the external correspondence to an interior shift. The third event, the shifting atmosphere of communities, built on both of the first two, because it required both people who had been individually changed and people who had found new territory, the convergence of these producing a critical mass of genuine interior quality within communities that changed the character of what was possible within them. And the fourth event, the reconciliation, was the culmination of all three, requiring the individual encounters of the first, the new possibilities of the second, and the changed community atmospheres of the third, as the conditions in which the healing of long-standing separations could finally find adequate ground. Each event necessary for the next, none of them sufficient alone. All of them parts of a single coherent intention. There is something within what I was shown that I have been careful about sharing, not because I doubt it, but because it is the most personally specific part of what I received, and I have been uncertain about how much of it belongs in a general account. I'm going to share it now because I have come to believe that the personal specificity of it is actually part of its value, that it demonstrates something important about the nature of what I received. Within the broader vision of March 2026, I was shown something that related directly to my own life, a specific situation I had been carrying for several years that had reached what appeared to be permanent impasse. I had stopped expecting any change in it, had reorganized my expectations around its permanence, had done what I advise my engineering clients to do when a structural problem cannot be solved as presented. I had redesigned my understanding of what was possible to exclude what had proven impossible. What I was shown suggested that this situation was one of those sealed doors I described in the second event, and that what I had understood as permanent closure was actually something else, the closure that develops an interior quality in the person waiting outside it. I received this with a mixture of emotions I am still processing, the hope it offered, sitting alongside the cost of having to revise an adaptation I had worked hard to arrive at. But what I keep returning to is not the content of what I was shown about my specific situation. It is the quality of care that the showing of it represented, the attention to the particular details of a particular person's particular life that the specificity of it demonstrated, and what that specificity tells me about the nature of the presence that was showing me everything else. The return to physical awareness happened with the same gradual quality that the departure had, and I find this symmetry meaningful in ways I haven't fully articulated. The same unhurried pace in both directions, the same quality of gentleness, The same sense of a transition being managed with care for the person making it, rather than simply executed at whatever speed served the purposes of the transition itself. I came back to my body the way morning comes to a room, incrementally. Each increment of returning, bringing a little more of the familiar world back into sensory focus. The first thing I was clearly aware of was the desk. My calculations still spread across it. The structural assessment still waiting with the patience of paper for my return. The coffee at my elbow now thoroughly cold. And the particular afternoon light laying itself across the calculations at a different angle than I remembered, telling me, without ambiguity, that considerably more time had passed than my interior experience of the event had suggested. I looked at the calculations for a long time before I touched them, aware that I was back in the world where load distributions mattered, and that I had just come from a place where a different kind of load-bearing reality had been made visible to me. What I noticed most acutely in those first minutes of return was the quality of detail in the ordinary world, the specific texture of the papers under my hands, the grain of the desk surface, the sound of a truck on the street below the window. These ordinary sensory facts arriving with an unusual quality of presence, as though each one had been waiting to be properly noticed and was now being received with the attention it had always deserved. I had the distinct sense that the way I had been perceiving ordinary experience before that afternoon had been slightly removed from it, slightly at a distance, and that what I was experiencing now was contact at a proximity I hadn't previously maintained. In the months between that February afternoon and the approach of March 2026, I have been doing several things with what I received, and I want to be honest about what those things are, because I think the doing matters as much as the receiving. The first thing I did was write everything down. With the same methodical precision I bring to structural assessments, every detail of each of the 4 events, every quality of the connections between them, every specific impression from the more personal dimensions of what I was shown. I wanted a record that I could return to, that wouldn't be subject to the natural drift of memory. The second thing I did was quieter and more internal. I began paying attention to the signs that the first event was already in motion, because what I was shown suggested that the wave of unexpected encounter doesn't begin on a specific date like a scheduled event. It has been building, gathering the way a structural load builds gradually before it reaches the threshold of visible effect. I began noticing the small indicators, people in my immediate circle describing experiences they couldn't account for, a quality of searching in conversations that hadn't been there before, the particular restlessness in people who are approaching an interior threshold without yet knowing it. The third thing I have been doing is the most personal. I have been preparing my own interior for what I was shown, not in a formulaic way, not through the execution of a spiritual checklist, but through the consistent practice of turning my attention toward the presence I encountered in that space, attempting to maintain in ordinary daily life a quality of orientation toward that presence that the extraordinary circumstances of my experience made temporarily obvious. I have had varying degrees of success with this. There are days when the ordinary asserts itself with a completeness that makes the February afternoon feel remote and theoretical. And there are days when what I encountered feels as close and as present as the structural calculations on my desk. And I have learned to receive both kinds of days without treating either of them as the definitive one. There is a question I find myself holding as March 2026 approaches, and I want to share it not as a conclusion, not as a summary of everything I have described, but simply as the question that is most alive in me right now, as someone who was shown something and is now living in proximity to the time when what was shown will either manifest or not. The question is not whether what I was shown is accurate. I find I have a settled quality of confidence about that which doesn't require the defending that less settled things require. The question I carry is something more personal, more demanding. It is a question about my own quality of readiness, not readiness in the sense of preparation for external events, but readiness in the interior sense. The question of whether I am cultivating the quality of attention and orientation that what I was shown requires for genuine participation. Because what I understood most clearly from everything I received was that what is approaching in March 2026 is not a spectator event. It is not something that will happen to passive observers. Each of the 4 things I was shown has the quality of something that moves through people who are genuinely open and genuinely present, who are paying attention at the right level, who have done enough interior work to have the capacity to recognize what is arriving and respond to it with the quality of presence it deserves. And so the question I carry is simply whether I am that person, not in a self-critical way, not in a way that produces anxiety, but in the way that a good engineer asks whether a structure is ready for the load it was designed to bear, with the honest and practical intention of doing whatever the answer requires.